Dr. Andrew Snelling earned his Ph.D. in geology from the University of Sydney in Australia. He has extensive experience in the Australian mining industry and has conducted intensive research on methods used in dating rocks. Dr. Snelling was a key contributor on the Institute for Creation Research's RATE project, which studied radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. He now serves as the Director of Research for Answers in Genesis. In this video, Rock Strata, Fossils, and the Flood, Dr. Snelling examines several compelling evidences for a global catastrophe. The existence of intercontinental sedimentary rock layers and massive fossil graveyards are just a few of the examples he brings to light.
I want to start where we ought to start. Jesus, the Creator, spoke of the days of Noah as a literal historical period in which a real man, Noah, lived. And he spoke of Noah entering the ark and the flood coming and taking them all away as real, literal history in which there was an ark and a life-destroying global flood. Now, if Jesus believed that, then so should you and I. Now, when it comes to looking at the Earth's rock strata and asking about the flood and what the rocks mean in terms of the flood, we have to be honest and say the Earth and its rock strata, the rock layers, only look old because of the way they're interpreted, the assumptions that people use to interpret what we see and measure, how quickly the geological processes occur. And the underlying assumptions that geologists use today, that most people automatically think, is that only present observable geological processes have been operating at the present rates to explain how the rock layers formed. And that's how most people think. When they look at rock layers, they automatically think millions of years because they've been brainwashed into thinking that only present-day processes operating at present-day rates could ever be responsible for all the rock layers. And so it's obvious, isn't it? If you have that assumption, geological processes are so slow today. Of course, there's occasional spurts when you have a local flood or a catastrophe like a hurricane, that if that's the way geological processes have always operated, then, well, it could have taken billions of years to form the Earth's rock layers. But the real question we have to ask ourselves is this: is the present, what we observe in the present, the key to understanding the past? Because that's the underlying assumption in all of modern geology, that the present observable processes explains what happened in the past. You know, Satan is very cunning because he likes to turn things upside down, because the scriptures teach us the other way around. Understanding what happened in the past explains the present. The present is abnormal. It's not the way the Earth was originally created, and that's not the way geological processes have always operated. So is the present is the key to the past? For example, a good question: do we see vast fossil beds forming today? When was the last time you saw all the dead fish on the bottom of the ocean waiting to be fossilised? I mean, I say this to young kids, they can understand it. What happens when a fish dies? Does it sink or float? It floats where it rots. So how do you form a fossil? Good question, I'm glad you asked. So do we see vast fossil beds forming today? The answer is no. Therefore, the present can't be the key to the past. You see, amongst geologists now, even in the conventional scientific community, there's increasing recognition that most fossil beds and most rock layers required catastrophic geological processes to form. And that's what we observe today. You have a hurricane and it forms a layer of sand as a result of washing up onto the land. And therefore, a catastrophic global flood, as we read in the Bible, is a viable explanation for the fossils and the rock layers that we see in the geologic record. The reliable record that God has given us of what happened in the past. God's record of earth history. And what do we read about the flood? All the fountains of the great deep were broken up. The windows of floodgates of heaven were open. The rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, you only have to have 1 day and night of rainfall and you've got a local flood. Imagine 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rainfall all around the globe. But that wasn't all. Remember the fountains? Those fountains of the great deep broke open first. There was more water that flooded from inside the earth that spurted out and spread over the earth's surface. For 150 days, we're told, the fountains were opened. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole of the heavens and the mountains were covered. Does that sound like a global flood? It reads like it. All flesh that moved upon the earth died, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground. You see, when we read that account, we cannot escape that it had global implications. You know, when many Christians are confronted with a difficult question, they often get embarrassed because they don't have answers. You know the way Jesus often answered a question? He asked a question in return. You know, if someone says to you, there's no evidence for Noah's flood, do you stand there dumbfounded trying to think of what evidence you could give them? Or are you smart enough to say to them, wait a minute, if Noah's flood really occurred, what evidence would you look for? Most Christians haven't thought about that. If Noah's flood really... Remember what it said? All the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered, and the mountains were covered, and all the creatures died. If Noah's flood really occurred, what evidence would you expect to find? Well, you've heard it tonight already, haven't you? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, I want to unpack that for you. Major evidences for the flood. Would we expect that the ocean waters flooded over the continents? Of course, we're told all the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered in water. We'd expect to find that the animals and plants were rapidly buried. And that's exactly what we find. We'd expect to find as the waters travelled across the continents, they'd deposit sand and mud right across the continents. So we'd expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited strata. And we'd expect the sand and the mud and the lime to be transported vast, long distances. A global flood would carry sediments globally. And that's exactly what we find. We'd expect to also find that there was rapid or no erosion between the strata. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. Because you see, the geologists today will tell you that yes, occasionally you'll get a catastrophic event that will produce one rock layer, and a catastrophic event will produce the next rock layer, but there's millions of years in between. What I want to show you is that if the flood really occurred, there wouldn't be millions of years in between. There'd be only evidence of rapid or no erosion, so that it was continuous water deposition of all the rock layers. Well, let's go into this in detail. First of all, the ocean waters flooded over the continents. What evidence would we expect to find of that having occurred? Very simple. We'd expect to find marine fossils in rock layers that cover the mountains. My second son, last October, November, was in Nepal, in the Himalayas, and he brought me back a fossil of a seashell, a sea creature from the Himalayas. Those mountains were formed by rock layers deposited during the flood. when the waters were over the continents. We'd expect to find rapid burial of creatures and plants, and we do. We find what we call extensive fossil graveyards. Billions of creatures buried together catastrophically and exquisitely preserved. Let me give you some examples. Let's go to the Grand Canyon, which is a textbook, an icon of evolutionary geology, which is one of the reasons why we as creationists have gone to the Grand Canyon to show that the evidence declares Noah's flood. Now, each of these rock layers you see marked there, every one of those rock layers has marine fossils in them. You go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and you have marine fossils. You're over a mile above sea level. The waters flooded over the continents. Let's go halfway down and look at the red wall limestone. Now, geologists give rocks fancy names. Why do you think they call it red wall limestone? Well, it's very easy. It forms a red wall. And so there's the red wall limestone from the rim, and there's the red wall limestone from the Colorado River. Now, inside these limestone, you have these marine fossils. On your left there, you can see a crinoid or sea lily. On the right, you can see a bryozoan or a lace coral. Lots of sea creatures, all buried together, all broken up. They didn't live that way, but they were buried that way. One of the most interesting fossils in the red wall limestone is this creature called a nautiloid. You're all familiar with the modern nautilus, which is a coiled shellfish that has a tube that sucks in water. Well, in fact, you can see that in this critter. In the middle there, you can see the remains of a tube. He sucked in water and squirted it out. It was like a jet engine. In fact, that's where engineers got the idea for a jet engine. Had a head like a squid, and he propelled himself through the water. Well, in the Grand Canyon, we find in this red wall limestone, in one layer within the limestone, billions of these nautiloids. It's about a 7-foot thick layer, and it stretches from one end of the canyon to the other. In fact, you can see it in the suburbs of Las Vegas. This fossil bed, limestone full of these nautiloid fossils, billions of them. They're in a 2-meter thick bed, all mixed up with crinoids, corals, brachiopods, gastropods, which are marine snails and clams, and these lace corals. The bed covers an area of 30,000 square kilometres. It represents a mass kill and burial event of an entire living population. Within hours, a gravity-driven sediment flow travelling at 5 metres per second. 5 metres per second. It's about 12 miles an hour, 10 to 12 miles per hour. And that whole bed of nautiloids, those nautiloids were buried. It was a living population, all different size nautiloids, all buried together, and many of their shells are facing in the same direction. They were all travelling with the water currents, and they were overwhelmed. They were nailed by this sediment flow. So that's an example of an extensive fossil graveyard, right there in the middle of the Grand Canyon rock sequence. Other examples, we can go to France, and we find hundreds of thousands of marine creatures buried with amphibians, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects, and reptiles. Notice that? Marine creatures with spiders. Where do spiders live? Normally on the land. You know, people get this idea that you only find marine fossils in this layer and land creatures in this layer. No, you often find them mixed together. Well, that's not the way they lived, is it? You don't find marine creatures living with spiders up on the land. So we can't say that this is where these creatures live, but what can we say? This is where they're buried, because we find them buried together in these rock layers. They were catastrophically buried by a catastrophe that affected both the land and the ocean at the same time. We go to Colorado, the Florence fossil beds, a wide variety of insects, freshwater mollusks, fish, birds, several hundred plant species. By the way, how long does it take to fossilise a bird? If you don't get him quickly, he just flies away. Again, notice a mixture of different creatures all buried together. And here's some example. Here's a fish from this Colorado fossil bed. A bee. I mean, look at the exquisite detail. You can see the venation in the wings. You have to bury him catastrophically, burying him with birds and blossoms. Exquisite detail. It had to be catastrophic burial and preservation. Another example, in Wyoming, in the Green River Shales, alligator, fish of many varieties, even up to 6 feet long, buried with birds, turtles, mammals, clams, crustaceans, many varieties of insects and palm leaves. Again, a mixture of land and water-dwelling creatures. And one of my favourites from my own country, thousands of marine creatures, corals, lace corals, bryozoans, mollusks or clams, buried with a toothed whale and a marsupial possum in Fossil Bluff on the northwest coast of Tasmania, our island state. And here's Fossil Bluff. It's about 80 feet high, and it's a sandy limestone. And at the base of the cliff, we find this jumbled mass of broken clam shells with you can see pebbles in there. And they're all broken up and smashed. In fact, in some places you can see boulders the size of houses and cars. It was catastrophic water action that smashed up all these creatures and buried them together. And here in the museum in Hobart, the capital city of the state, we see the remains of the toothed whale. And here's the remains of the marsupial possum. Now, again, think about it, because most people don't think, by the way. Asking intelligent questions. When was the last time you saw a whale and a possum living together? Why do I ask that question? Because conventional geologists look at these fossil beds and interpret them as past living environments and habitats, don't they? But when you look at a rock bed, do you see all the palm trees growing and the sandy beaches of the environment that was supposed to be there? No, you see a rock layer with dead things in it. That's all you see. So when was the last time you saw possums and whales living together? No. Again, all we can say, this is where they are buried together. Well, how did they get buried together? What would cause a whale to be buried with a possum? A whale lives out in the deep ocean, so it had to be something that affected both the deep ocean and the land at the same time. Get the picture? It had to be a catastrophic global flood that affected both the deep ocean and the land. Isn't that the kind of evidence we'd expect to find? Of course it is, and we find it. Here's another example. This will blow your minds. Trillions of microscopic marine creatures, plus large coiled shells called ammonites and other marine creatures. In fact, we even find a dinosaur fossil in the chalk beds. And I'll show you an example in a moment. Think about another fossil deposit we find all around the world. Trillions of tons of buried vegetation in the world's coal beds, found on almost every continent. Even Antarctica, they have coal beds. Here's from the chalk of England. Here's this large coiled shellfish, an ammonite. That example there is about 2 feet across. In the Netherlands, they actually found a dinosaur fossil in the chalk beds. But what is the chalk mainly made up of? Microscopic, tiny shellfish. That's under the microscope. And the geologists say it was shellfish by shellfish that died and sank to the bottom of the ocean over thousands and thousands and thousands of years it took to lay inch by inch by inch. Well, how long did the ammonite fossil have to sit there waiting to be buried? Or the dinosaur? It had to be catastrophic. All these critters, there were huge algal blooms, these blooms on the ocean during the flood because of all the chemicals that were in the water. They proliferated and whoosh, they died out and they buried these other creatures with them catastrophically. Look at the exquisite preservation of this fossil fish. Its eye sockets, its fins. As I said before, when was the last time you saw the dead fish on the bottom of the ocean waiting to be fossilised? They float where they rot, By the time they get buried, they don't look like that. There's a trilobite. It gets its name. It has 3 lobes, trilobite. It has a tail section, a midsection, and a head section. Notice up on your left there, you can see it has 2 eyes. I tell you, this trilobite is very well designed. Its lens systems are preserved for us because they're made of the mineral that makes up limestone, and they've been fossilised and preserved for us in exquisite detail. This is one of my favourite fossils, Morsinites sprigii. It comes from outback South Australia. Figured out what it is, by the way? That's a fossilised jellyfish. Now, you know what happens to a jellyfish when it gets washed up on the beach? The sun shines on it, it's just jelly, so it melts. If the wind and the waves crash on the beach, it gets broken up. That's why the geologist who found these fossils, and he found hundreds of them over 400 square miles in outback South Australia, he concluded that they all formed in less than a day. He's absolutely right, less than a day. Beautiful preservation, hundreds and hundreds of these jellyfish fossils. By the way, one fish here didn't get time to finish his breakfast before the 2 of them were buried and fossilised. Could that have been a slow and gradual process? Absolutely not. And I love this because it comes from, it's a photograph on the frontispiece of a textbook on vertebrate fossils and evolution. You know, when this photograph was published in the journal Nature, one of the world's leading scientific journals, comes out weekly, the editor put under the caption, time freeze frame. What did he mean? Why? Well, that's an ichthyosaur, a mother ichthyosaur, and she's 6 feet long. So she's not small, she's very large. An ichthyosaur was a marine reptile. So it's not a fish, it's actually a marine reptile. Now notice something interesting. Can you see a protrusion underneath her tail? That's a baby ichthyosaur. 1 minute, mother was giving birth to a baby, next minute, buried and fossilised. She didn't even get time to escape before tons of sand and mud went whoosh. She was buried alive. No wonder the editor of Nature had to be honest and said that this was a time freeze frame. Catastrophic burial, exquisite fossil preservation. The fossil record has abundant examples. We don't have to be embarrassed to talk to people about a global catastrophic flood. What other evidence would we look for? We'd expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited strata or rock layers. And what do we find? We find rock layers that can be traced all the way across continents and even between continents. Why should we be surprised that the evidence in God's world agrees with exactly what we read in God's word? We also find physical features in these widespread rock layers that indicate they were rapidly deposited. Let me give you some examples. The Coconino sandstone, the Red Wall limestone, the Tapete sandstone, 3 rock layers in the Grand Canyon. Here they are in real life. The Coconino sandstone is that creamy coloured sandstone in the rim. We've met the Red Wall limestone halfway down, and the Tapete sandstone is that little cliff down the bottom. And what do we find? We find that these 3 rock units belong to 5 sequences of strata or rock layers that can be traced right across North America, right across the country. Let me give you an example. That's the Tapete sandstone and its equivalents. Can be traced right across the United States and all the way up into Canada. Why should we be surprised to find that there's a layer of sand that goes right across the continent? Widespread, rapidly deposited rock layers. You know, the Red Wall limestone that you saw before with those nautiloid fossils in it, the same limestone is found in Tennessee and Pennsylvania and all the way over in England. I had a friend with me in the Grand Canyon a few years ago from England, a geologist, and he was amazed. He says, this is exactly the same limestone with the same fossils that we've got over in England. Right across continents and between continents. And the chalk beds I told you about before. Most people don't realise that those chalk beds that we see on the southern English coast can be traced right across to Northern Ireland and the other way across Europe underneath Germany and Poland, all the way down to Egypt, Israel, Turkey. We can even find it in Kazakhstan. The same limestone with the same fossils is found in the Midwest US from Nebraska to Texas and over in southern Western Australia. The same fossils, the same rock layer above, the same rock layer below, the same chalk beds. And it's all full of these trillions of tiny shellfish fossils. That's a global deposit of a rock layer containing a fossil graveyard. What more evidence do you need of a global catastrophic flood? Well, let's have a look at the Coconino sandstone. It's an interesting sandstone. It's 315 feet thick, and in it has some unusual features. We call these crossbeds. The layer of sand is horizontal, but you've got these slanting patterns running through the sandstone. What do they mean? What are they? Well, we call them crossbeds, and how do they form? They're actually the remains of underwater sand dunes. Underwater sand dunes. And here's a diagram to show how they form. You have the sand being carried along by the water, and it mounds up and it keeps on moving and moving, and each current comes along, the next layer gets layered on top of the next one. We can actually see this similar sort of process under the Golden Gate Bridge of San Francisco in the channel there. You know, the Coconino sandstone also covers hundreds of thousands of square miles. And we can put all this information together. The average thickness is 315 feet thick, covers an area of more than 100,000 square miles, at least. Some suggest it could be double that. The volume of sand is at least 10,000 cubic miles. Some suggest it could be double that, 20,000 cubic miles. And it was deposited as multiple sheets of these sand waves or underwater sand dunes up to 60 feet high. We can work that out experimentally by looking at the evidence in the rock. Moving along by water, moving at 3 to 5 miles per hour. Now, you might think that's slow, but at that rate, the whole sandstone bed would be formed in just a few days. Over 10,000 cubic miles of sand transported and deposited over 100,000 square miles in just a few days. So it only takes a few days for this layer, a few days for that layer, a few days for the next layer. The sum total of all the layers in the Grand Canyon isn't millions of years. It's just a few weeks, in fact. Well, let's go back to Australia. In the centre of Australia, some of you have heard of Ayers Rock or Uluru. It's actually a giant sandstone bed that's been tilted upright. It's poking up vertically out of the ground, and it's been eroded. And we can get different views. You can see those sandstone layers or sticking upright, these sandstone beds. The total thickness of these sandstone beds is 18 to 20,000 feet. It's not all exposed. Some of it has to be discovered by drilling in the surrounding desert sands. Now, this sandstone is very interesting. We can look at it under the microscope, and we can actually see the evidence that this sandstone bed was formed very rapidly. Look at those sandstone grains. Notice they're all different sizes. Notice that? There's little ones, big ones. Ever tried an experiment where you got a mixture of sand and mud and water in a jar and shook it all up and let it settle down? What happens? It separates to the large grains at the bottom and then the finer grains at the top. Over time. But here we have a mixture. What does that tell us? Big grains and little grains all mixed up together means that there was no time for them to separate into their grain sizes. See, it doesn't take much logic to figure these things out. Notice something else. A lot of those grains have jagged corners on them. See that? Some of those grains have got pointy corners. Now, what happens when, we go to the biggest scale? Let's take pebbles rolling down a riverbed. What happens to them? Are they all jagged? No, they get rounded because they bump into one another and then edges get knocked off and they get perfectly smooth with time. But if there wasn't time, what would they be like? Jagged. You see how easy it is to see the evidence? Jagged grains mean there was not sufficient time for them to be rounded. So there was no time to sort them and there was no time to round them. The third observation is not as obvious to you as it is to me, but you can see on the right-hand side a grain that has got all these stripes in it. That's a particular mineral that is unique to this sandstone that's not found in many others. It's a mineral called feldspar. And it doesn't. Why isn't it in most sandstones? Is because it disintegrates very rapidly. These sandstone layers or beds are now tilted at about 80 degrees. The total thickness of these sandstone layers is about 18 to 20,000 feet. That's about 3 to 4 miles. The sand grains were eroded and transported at least 63 miles. The jagged grains, the different sizes, and the fresh feldspar implies rapid transport and deposition. It all happened in a matter of hours. Sediment slurries travelling at 70 miles per hour would have been responsible for depositing these 3 to 4 miles thickness of sand beds in just a couple of hours. Remember what we said before? If the water currents go over the continents, they're going to carry that sand and mud and lime long distances. Well, let me give you an example. The sediment in widespread, rapidly deposited strata had to be eroded from distant source areas. What do I mean by that? We'll come to it in a minute. Rapid or no erosion between strata. We wouldn't find evidence of millions of years between the rock layers, as many geologists claim. We'd either find evidence of only rapid erosion or no erosion between the rock layers. So the examples will illustrate this very, very well for you. My first example, again, is the Coconino sandstone. It's made up, you saw how white it looked. It's made of pure sand. And it had to come from a far distant source. Why? Underneath this pure white sandstone, we have this mud rock called the Hermit Shale. It's reddy brown. It's composed of silt and mud. So, could the sand in the sandstone have been eroded from that shale? No, it's a different rock altogether. Everywhere we find the Coconino sandstone, underneath it is the Hermit Shale. And it stretches for mile after mile after mile. That means the sand which makes up the Coconino sandstone had to come from further away than from every outcrop where the Hermit Shale is underneath. And that happens to be way up in the north of the US. So it had to come all the way from the north of the US down to the Grand Canyon area, a long distance of sediment transport. I'll give you another interesting example. Even the conventional scientists now suggest that the sand grains making up the Navajo sandstone, which we find in Zion National Park higher up the sequence in southern Utah, was transported all the way across the United States from the Appalachians. Only a global flood could carry sand grains that far right across the continent. In fact, in the rock layers we find water current direction indicators like ripple marks. Those cross beds that I told you about, that have the evidence of the sand waves, they indicate the directions in which the water was flowing. And the evidence in the rocks throughout the walls of the Grand Canyon and right across North America, in fact right across South America, is that the water, for supposedly 300 million years of conventional thinking, was always flowing from northeast to southwest across those two continents. Of course it wasn't 300 million years. What about rapid or no erosion between rock layers? Well, we'd expect to find evidence of rapid erosion where the water currents ripped up the rock layer underneath. That was rapid and catastrophic, and we see that exactly at the base, at the bottom of the Tapete sandstone, where the rock layers underneath were ripped off and the sandstone was formed very rapidly. In fact, these beds in the Tapete sandstone are just the same as beds of sand that are deposited after hurricanes. And we find in the base of the Tapete sandstone boulders. Some of these boulders are huge, up to 19 feet across, rapidly flowing water currents. And they rapidly eroded everything underneath and then deposited this sandstone bed. So there was rapid erosion in that instance. And then sometimes we find evidence of local rapid erosion between rock layers. For example, at the base of the Redwall limestone, we find underneath, the limestone underneath, there's been channels cut rapidly and another limestone deposited in there. But here's the one I like the best, where you have knife edge boundaries between rock layers, which is often the norm. Often the norm. Now you think about it. You think about it. If a rock layer is deposited, then it's sitting out there for millions of years before the next rock layer is deposited on top of it. What would you expect to happen? You'd expect the soil to form, you'd expect erosion, you'd get gullies, you'd get an uneven topography over millions of years, supposedly. Well, how many millions of years are there between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale? Look at that perfect knife edge boundary, absolutely flat from one end of the Grand Canyon to the other. Not even a hint of any millions of years between. It was continuous, rapid deposition. Here's another example of the rapid succession of the strata, of the rock layers. Folding of whole rock layer sequences without fracturing. Let me explain to you what I mean. Have you ever tried to bend a rock? A hard, solid rock. Yeah, you try to bend it. Can you do it easily? Not very easily. I have to usually subject rocks to punishment by hitting them with a hammer. And what happens? Because it is hard and brittle, it fractures, it shatters. So if you try to bend a rock and it's hard, it's going to snap. Okay. Well, how do you explain this in the Grand Canyon? That's the Tapete sandstone, where the sandstone has been bent through 90 degrees. And it's not the only rock layer. You can go up another side canyon from the Colorado River, you can see the Redwall limestone, the Muave limestone, all the rock layers above are all bent in the same 90-degree angle. Now, do you see any fracturing there? You go up nice and close and it's actually smooth. The bend is nice and smooth. Now, how would you bend a rock like that? Well, the scientists, the conventional scientists, it's so simple. You bury it down deep enough, and under pressure and heat, the heat and the pressure will cause it to bend slowly. Well, what they forget to tell you is that the heat and pressure will also metamorphose the sandstone and turn it into another rock. So when we look at that, do we see a rock that's been affected by heat and pressure? Absolutely not. It's the same sandstone as everywhere else in the Grand Canyon. So, how would you bend a sandstone? When it's still soft, when it's still wet, just after it's been deposited. You'd bend it because it's still wet and it's still plastic. It's like having clay, modelling clay, before it dries out. It's still soft and plastic and you can bend it. Okay? So now you understand how that would form. But here's the problem. Not for you and me, but for the conventional geologist with his millions of years. Why? Because the whole rock sequence making up the walls of the Grand Canyon was supposedly laid down over 300 million years. After 300 million years, the Tapete sandstone was down the bottom of over 4,000 feet of other rock layers. And then 480 million years after the Tapete sandstone was buried, the earth movements caused that bending. Well, do you think that the Tapete sandstone would be still soft and plastic after 480 million years buried under 4,000 feet of strata? No. He's got a real problem. Let's put it like this. The Tapete sandstone was supposedly deposited 550 million years ago. Other rock layers were laid on top to the rim of the Grand Canyon over 300 million years. So that 250 million years ago, the last rock layer was deposited. And then 70 million years ago, 480 million years after the Tapete sandstone was deposited, we had this bending, this earth movement that pushed up the rock layers and bent them. But the Tapete sandstone is folded as though it is still soft from being deposited 480 million years earlier. What does that tell us? The 480 million years never existed. Well, one last example. Polystrate fossils. That is, fossils which require multiple rock layers to bury them. Poly means many, straight means layers. Many layers, fossils. That means fossils that go up through many layers. And the best way to show you is to give you examples. Here, from Newcastle, just north of Sydney, on the east coast of Australia, you can see on the left there a photograph of two coal seams, two coal beds. On the right is a cartoon diagram with labels on it to help you understand what you see. Sitting on top of the bottom coal bed, you see two tree stumps. In fact, you can see another tree stumps on the horizon poking up through the top coal bed. When these fossils were first found, 100 years ago this year in fact, these tree stumps went all the way from the bottom coal bed right up through the top coal bed. In between are four layers of volcanic ash. By the way, the geologists say the coal beds were formed slowly in a swamp. These trees happen to be pine trees that can't grow in swamps. And they're trees that don't have any roots on them. The roots have been broken off. Sounds a bit to me like what happened at Mount St. Helens. And in fact, this is a perfect example of exactly what you'd expect to find on the bottom of Spirit Lake at Mount St. Helens. The peat forming on the bottom of Mount St. Helens, tree stumps sinking vertically, being buried in volcanic ash, going through many rock layers that couldn't have taken millions of years to form. In fact, if the conventional geologists are correct, these pine trees that don't grow in swamps, that don't have any roots on them, must have been sitting on top of this swamp, buried by all these volcanic ash beds, and then had thousands of years of another swamp and survived still to be sticking up through the top. You see how easy it is to argue that you only needed rapid deposition of these rock layers, including the coal beds. Otherwise, these pine trees would not have been preserved in this upright position. Joggins, Nova Scotia, on the far eastern of Canada, we find hundreds of these vertical trees, stumps, poking up through many layers. Let me give you the details. These upright fossil trees penetrate 20 geological horizons through 2,500 feet. And that implies that all these 2,500 feet of strata had to bury these trees rapidly before they could rot. Well, does it really matter whether we believe in Noah's flood or not? You know, some Christians say, this is just too divisive and controversial. Let's just concentrate on presenting the gospel message. But remember, Jesus said, "For had ye believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if ye believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words?" And Jesus, we said before, referred to Noah. He referred to the flood. And Jesus said, if you don't believe what Moses wrote about the flood, how are you going to believe what I'm telling you? We need to remind you again that there was no bloodshed and death of soulish or nephesh life prior to the fall. Adam and Eve weren't walking in a garden that was full of dinosaur fossils underneath their feet. God saw everything that he'd made, and behold, it was very good. How does God measure goodness? Jesus said there's none good but God. God's creation was perfect. There was no death or evidence of death, suffering, or violence in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve walked in it before the fall and the curse. And they were all vegetarians to begin with. I'm just giving you a revision, aren't I? You're revising your knowledge of Genesis. And the fall affected the whole creation. You'll see where I'm leading in a moment. We're told that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. It's been subjected because of man's rebellion and the curse that followed. What is the implication of what Genesis is teaching us here? The implication is that if there was no death of soulish or soul-bearing creatures, no bloodshed before the fall, then there could have been no fossils formed before the fall, and thus no fossils in the ground prior to the creation of Adam and Eve. But of course, evolutionary geology insists that there were countless fossils buried in rock layers formed over millions and millions, in fact at least 500 million years before man supposedly arrived. We've got two diametrically opposed belief systems here. See, that's why the evidence matters. That's why understanding the geological evidence that teaches that Noah's flood really did occur. Because whose view is correct? That of God the Creator who was there, who has told us what He did, confirmed by the testimony of Jesus Christ, or that of the fallible scientists who were not there? You see, as I close, if the biblical record is literally correct, then most of the fossils formed during the flood. And there never were 500 million years. And the earth is therefore young, just as the Bible teaches. Thank you.